Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet submarine officer, single-handedly prevented a Soviet nuclear torpedo launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis, an act which U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later stated would have almost certainly triggered a full nuclear exchange. The U.S. military's own estimates for a major nuclear war in the early 1960s, under plans like SIOP-62, projected that over 300 million people in the Soviet Union, China, and allied nations would be killed in the initial hours. Both superpowers possessed thousands of nuclear weapons, many of them orders of magnitude more powerful than the bombs that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and maintained policies that could trigger launch based solely on electronautic warnings of an attack before any detonations confirmed it. One Soviet H-bomb test, the Tsar Bomba, yielded 50 megatons. The original design was for 100 megatons. Number 11. The global thermostat gets wrecked. Big time. Imagine hundreds, even thousands of nuclear warheads detonating over cities, industrial areas, and military targets across the Northern Hemisphere. Each explosion would ignite massive firestorms, colossal infernos far beyond conventional experience. These firestorms would burn for days, pumping enormous plumes of black, sooty smoke high into the atmosphere, reaching the stratosphere. Scientists in the 1980s, notably Carl Sagan and Richard Turco, developed the nuclear winter hypothesis based on this. Once in the stratosphere, this soot would be incredibly persistent, as there's no rain there to wash it out. It would spread globally, forming a dense shield against incoming sunlight. Within weeks, surface temperatures across the continents of the Northern Hemisphere could plummet by 20 to 40 degrees Celsius, or even more in continental interiors. Summer days could be below freezing. Critical agricultural regions in North America, Europe, and Asia would experience killing frosts even in July or August for 1 to 3 years, or possibly longer. The Southern Hemisphere would also experience significant cooling, though likely less severe. Growing seasons would be eliminated or drastically shortened worldwide. This sudden prolonged cold snap would lead to the collapse of agriculture on a global scale. Beyond the cold, global precipitation patterns would be severely disrupted. Monsoons in Asia and Africa, vital for agriculture, feeding billions, could fail. The injection of nitrogen oxides from the fireballs into the upper atmosphere would also lead to a severe depletion of the ozone layer. This would allow much higher levels of harmful ultraviolet UVB radiation to reach the surface once the soot eventually cleared, posing a threat to surviving humans, animals, and any recovering plant life. Cunald worldwide would face an unprecedented shock, with mass die-offs of plant and animal species unable to cope with the darkness, cold, and increased UV radiation. The gulleting implications are stark. Nations dependent on agriculture would face immediate catastrophic famine. Habitable zones would shrink, and any region still capable of producing food would become immensely valuable, likely leading to desperate conflicts over scarce resources. International aid and trade systems would cease to exist, leaving each surviving pocket of humanity to fend for itself in a newly hostile global climate. Number 10. Your capital city. Probably a parking lot. During the Cold War, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had elaborate targeting lists. These lists included counter-value targets, which meant cities, industrial complexes, and economic centers. The logic was that destroying a nation's ability to function, feed itself, and recover was as important as destroying its military. Major capital cities like Washington, D.C., Moscow, London, Paris, Beijing, and Bonn were high on these lists. A single large thermonuclear weapon, say 1 megaton, equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT and modest by late Cold War standards, detonated as an air burst over a typical capital city, would have unimaginable consequences. At ground zero, everything would be vaporized. For several miles in every direction, buildings would be flattened by the blast wave, which would propagate at supersonic speeds. Intense thermal radiation, a pulse of heat many times hotter than the sun's surface, would ignite fires across hundreds of square miles. These individual fires could coalesce into a firestorm, a phenomenon observed in Dresden and Tokyo during World War II, but on a vastly larger scale. A firestorm creates its own wind system, with hurricane-force winds, feeding the blaze, consuming all available oxygen, and raising temperatures to levels where steel melts and glass flows like liquid. Millions of people in such a city would die almost instantly from the blast, the heat, or the initial burst of nuclear radiation. Survivors in the surrounding areas would face lethal fallout, a rain of radioactive particles carried downwind. The destruction of a nation's capital means the decapitation of its government, central command and control, ministries, emergency services, headquarters, primary communication nodes, all would be gone. National records, archives, cultural treasures housed in museums and libraries would be obliterated. The intricate web of administration, commerce, and social organization that defines a modern state would simply cease to exist in that location. The psychological impact on any survivors across the nation would be profound. With no central authority, and likely many regional centers also hit, the concept of a unified nation-state would begin to unravel. Who would give orders? Who would organize relief or defense? The absence of the capital would create a power vacuum of unprecedented scale. Number 9. Suddenly, Australia is a superpower, maybe. In a full-scale nuclear exchange primarily focused on the Northern Hemisphere, countries in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly those geographically isolated and not directly targeted, such as Australia, New Zealand, parts of South America, and Southern Africa, would initially escape the direct devastation of nuclear blasts. However, they would not be unscathed. Radioactive fallout, though most intense in the mid-latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere, would eventually spread globally, leading to increased background radiation levels and associated health risks. More significantly, these nations would face the secondary effects, such as the climatic disruption of nuclear winter or nuclear autumn. Reduced sunlight and temperatures would impact their agriculture too, though perhaps less catastrophically than in the north. Complete collapse of global trade, finance, and communication systems would be a massive shock. Nations previously reliant on imports of fuel, manufactured goods, advanced technology, or even food would find themselves cut off. Australia, for instance, with its significant agricultural and mineral resources, might find itself in a relatively stronger position than many. It could potentially feed its population and had industrial capacity. However, it would also face enormous new challenges. Millions, potentially tens of millions, of desperate refugees from the devastated Northern Hemisphere might attempt to reach these less affected lands, leading to immense social and political pressures. Would these safer nations have the capacity or willingness to accept them? Or would they militarize their borders to repel them? Internally, the loss of established international order could lead to instability. Governments in the Southern Hemisphere would have to navigate a world where old alliances were meaningless and new threats could emerge from unexpected quarters. There might be a scramble for resources, with even previously neutral or less powerful nations attempting to secure what they need by force. While the term superpower implies a global reach that might be impossible in a post-WWIII world, relatively intact nations in the South could become regional hamons simply by virtue of having survived with some level of societal cohesion and resource base. Their long-term survival, however, would depend on their ability to adapt to a permanently altered global environment and a new, brutal international or non-international landscape. Number 8. Millions playing a deadly game of musical chairs for food. The most immediate and widespread consequence of a large-scale nuclear war after the initial blasts would be mass starvation. The nuclear winter or nuclear autumn effects, drastically reduced sunlight, plummeting temperatures, and disrupted rainfall would decimate agriculture globally. Even a more moderate cooling, as some models suggested, would shorten growing seasons sufficiently to cause widespread crop failures for several consecutive years. In the Northern Hemisphere, where most of the world's grain was produced, stored food supplies would be the only buffer. In the US, for instance, estimates suggested that existing food reserves might last the surviving population, assuming significant casualties, for perhaps a year, if distributed perfectly, which would be impossible in the chaos. After that, famine would set in. Areas that were major agricultural producers before the war would become battlegrounds for dwindling supplies. Urban survivors, if any, would face a desperate situation as cities historically rely on food brought in from rural areas. This supply chain would be utterly broken. Governments, if they still existed in any meaningful form, would likely attempt to seize and ration food, leading to hoarding, black markets, and violent resistance. The social fabric would tear apart as hunger became the dominant motivator. People would be forced to migrate in search of food, leading to massive refugee movements encountering other desperate, starving populations. Traditional food sources like fishing would also be severely impacted. Coastal waters could be heavily contaminated by radioactive fallout and runoff from land. Ocean ecosystems themselves would be disrupted by temperature changes and altered currents. Hunting and gathering would not be a viable alternative for billions of people. Wild food sources would be quickly exhausted and also potentially contaminated. The Gallon landscape would be redrawn based on one single factor: access to food. Any region that, through some fluke of geography or climate, could still produce even meager crops would become a target for conquest or desperate migration. Organized armed groups, warlords, or remnants of military units would fight over fertile land, stored food, and even potable water. Alliances would be meaningless, old enmities forgotten, in the face of existential hunger. The scale of death from starvation and malnutrition-related diseases would likely dwarf the direct casualties from nuclear weapons within a few years of the conflict. Number 7. The world's biggest lost and found is for nuclear weapons. A third world war involving nuclear weapons wouldn't necessarily mean every single warhead is launched and detonated perfectly. Command and control systems of both superpowers were designed to be robust, but a massive nuclear exchange would inevitably cause chaos and disruption. Some missiles might malfunction on launch. Some submarines carrying nuclear missiles could be sunk before firing their payloads, their reactors and warheads littering the seabed. Aircraft carrying nuclear bombs might be shot down over friendly, neutral, or enemy territory, their weapons lost or damaged, broken arrow incidents on an unprecedented scale. Furthermore, tactical nuclear weapons, smaller devices intended for battlefield use, were deployed in large numbers, particularly in Europe. In the chaos of a collapsing front, some of these could be overrun, lost, or fall into the hands of fragmented military units, or even non-state actors. If central governments collapsed in nuclear-armed states, the security of their remaining arsenals would become a terrifying question. Who controls the launch codes? Who guards the storage sites? Ambitious regional commanders, breakaway factions, or even well-organized criminal or terrorist groups could potentially seize intact nuclear weapons, or perhaps more easily, radiological materials from damaged reactors, or weapon components. Proliferation of even a few loose nukes into a world already shattered by war would create an enduring nightmare. These weapons could be used for blackmail, to settle old scores between surviving communities, or simply out of nihilistic despair. Technical knowledge to maintain and detonate such weapons, while complex, might be retained by surviving scientists or engineers who could be coerced or persuaded to assist new owners. Moreover, the vast quantities of fissile materials, plutonium and highly enriched uranium, present in the global arsenal, if not perfectly secured or consumed in explosions, could become a source for future cruder nuclear devices. Post-WWIII, world wouldn't just be recovering from the initial exchange, it would live under the constant threat of further, smaller-scale nuclear detonations from unpredictable sources, making any attempt at rebuilding society extraordinarily perilous. The dream of nuclear disarmament would be replaced by the nightmare of uncontrolled, atomized nuclear threat. Number 6. Government becomes a bedtime story. The very concept of a nation-state, with its centralized authority, rule of law, and provision of services, would likely not survive a full-scale nuclear World War II in many, if not most, of the directly affected countries. As described, capital cities, the nerve centers of government, would be primary targets. But beyond that, regional administrative centers, major industrial hubs, and communication networks would also be devastated. Even with continuity of government plans involving bunkers and dispersed leadership, the scale of destruction and societal collapse would overwhelm such measures. If the leadership is in a bunker, but there's no one to lead, no infrastructure to command, and no populace to govern in any organized fashion, what does government mean? In the immediate aftermath, survival would be the only imperative. Local communities, if they cohered at all, would likely fall under the control of whoever had the means to impose order or control resources. Perhaps surviving local police or military units, organized criminal gangs, monadic cult leaders, or simply ruthless individuals with weapons. This is the rise of warlordism. Regions might fragment into small competing fiefdoms. The rule of law would evaporate, replaced by the rule of force. Without functioning national or international economies, currency would become worthless. Barter, based on essential goods like food, water, fuel, medicine, and ammunition, would become the norm. The sophisticated structures of modern governance, healthcare systems, education, social welfare, infrastructure maintenance would all disappear. Knowledge of how to run these systems might survive among individuals, but the capacity to implement them would be gone. People would be forced to rely on pre-industrial modes of organization and survival. Trust beyond a very small local group would be a dangerous luxury. The stories of stable, organized governments providing security and services would become just that. Stories, legends from a lost world, told to children who had never known such a thing. Rebuilding any semblance of larger-scale governance would take generations, if not centuries, and would face constant threats from internal strife, resource wars, and the lingering environmental and health consequences of the war. Number 5. Getting a text message becomes a miracle. Our modern world runs on communication. Global finance, logistics, news, personal connections all depend on a vast, intricate network of satellites, undersea cables, terrestrial fiber optics, and wireless systems. A major nuclear war would systematically dismantle this. Strategic targets included not just cities and military bases, but also key communication nodes and infrastructure. Ground stations for satellite communication, major internet exchange points, and broadcasting facilities would be hit. More profoundly, many nuclear detonations, especially high-altitude bursts, HEMP, high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, would generate an incredibly powerful electromagnetic pulse. A single HEMP explosion, optimally placed over a continent, could instantly fry unshielded electronics across millions of square miles. This includes everything from the national power grid to individual cars, computers, radios, and yes, smigs. Satellites themselves, crucial for global communication, navigation, like GPS, and reconnaissance, would be vulnerable. Anti-satellite weapons, ASATs, were developed during the Cold War, and space was seen as a potential war-fighting domain. Many satellites would be directly targeted. Others would be disabled by the radiation environment created by multiple nuclear explosions in space or the upper atmosphere. The loss of GPS and other satellite navigation systems would cripple any surviving long-distance transport, military or civilian. The destruction of communication satellites would isolate continents, nations, and even local communities. Imagine no internet, no international phone calls, no global news broadcasts. Even local radio and television would likely be silenced due to damage to transmitters and the collapse of power grids. Information would travel, if at all, at the speed of a human messenger or via unreliable short-range radio if any working equipment and power sources could be found. The information age would end abruptly. This breakdown in communication would exacerbate every other crisis. Coordinating relief efforts, conveying warnings about fallout or other hazards, or even knowing what happened to loved ones would become nearly impossible. Rumor, misinformation, and fear would spread unchecked. Attempts to reorganize society or reestablish any form of governance would be severely hampered by the inability to communicate effectively over any significant distance. The world would become a collection of isolated, ignorant islands of survivors. Number 4. The oceans turn into a radioactive soup. The world's oceans, covering over 70% of the planet's surface, would not escape the catastrophic impact of a nuclear World War II. They would become vast repositories of radioactive contamination. One primary source would be naval warfare. Both the US and Soviet navies operated large fleets of nuclear-powered submarines, many armed with nuclear missiles. Aircraft carriers and some cruisers were also nuclear-powered. In a global conflict, many of these vessels would likely be sunk. Each sunken nuclear reactor would over time corrode and release its highly radioactive core materials into the marine environment. This process could contaminate large areas of the seabed and water column for centuries. Additionally, if nuclear weapons were used against naval fleets or coastal targets, the fallout generated would directly enter the ocean. Rivers, heavily contaminated from fallout over land and carrying irradiated soil and debris, would pour vast quantities of radioactive isotopes into coastal waters and estuaries. These areas are critical breeding grounds for many marine species. The accumulation of radionuclides, like strontium-90 cesium-137, and plutonium isotopes in seawater sediments and marine organisms would be widespread. This would decimate marine ecosystems. Plankton, the base of the oceanic food web, would absorb these isotopes, which would then become concentrated up the food chain, from small fish to larger predators and marine mammals. Seafood, a vital protein source for billions of people historically, would become dangerously inedible in many parts of the world for generations. Fishing industries would collapse. Coastal communities reliant on the sea would face ruin, not just from direct attacks, but from the poisoning of their environment. Ocean currents would slowly disperse the contamination, globally meaning even remote marine environments would not be entirely safe. Contamination wouldn't just stay in the water. Sea spray could carry radioactive particles inland, further contaminating coastal land. The sheer volume of the oceans might dilute the contamination to some extent over vast timescales, but hotspots of intense radioactivity would persist near sunken vessels, river mouths, and heavily targeted coastal zones, rendering these areas dangerous for decades or centuries. The GLE consequences include the loss of major food sources, the uninhabitability of extensive coastlines, and the disruption of any potential future maritime trade or travel. Number 3. Your doctor's new nemesis: radiation sickness for generations. The immediate effects of nuclear weapons, blast, heat, and initial radiation, are horrific enough. The lingering effects of radiation exposure, particularly from fallout, would plague survivors and their descendants for generations. Acute radiation sin, ARS, would affect millions exposed to high doses of fallout in the days and weeks after the attacks. Symptoms range from nausea and vomiting to hair loss, immune system collapse, internal bleeding, and at higher doses, rapid death. Medical systems already shattered would be utterly incapable of dealing with mass ARS casualties. There's no simple cure. Treatment involves supportive care that would be unavailable. For those who survived the initial high doses or received lower doses over longer periods, the long-term health consequences would be severe. The primary concern would be a massive increase in cancer rates, leukemia, thyroid, lung breast, and many other forms. Cancers could take years or even decades to develop after exposure. Beyond cancer, survivors would face higher risks of cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and immune system deficiencies, making them more susceptible to infectious diseases, which would likely be rampant in the unsanitary post-war conditions. Perhaps one of the most insidious long-term effects would be genetic damage. Radiation can damage DNA in reproductive cells, sperm, and eggs, leading to an increase in mutations passed on to future generations. This could manifest as higher rates of birth defects, hereditary diseases, and infant mortality in the children and grandchildren of survivors. While the extent of heritable genetic damage in humans from radiation is a complex and debated topic, studies on Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, as well as animal experiments, indicated genuine risk. The psychological burden on parents having children in such a world would be immense. Medical knowledge and facilities to diagnose or treat these radiation-induced illnesses would be scarce, if not non-existent, in many areas. Traditional medical expertise would be overwhelmed by the scale and novelty of the health crisis. The global gene pool itself would carry the invisible scars of the nuclear war, a legacy of sickness and fragility passed down through time, fundamentally altering the health trajectory of the human species. Number 2. Europe's holiday spots become no-go zones for centuries. Europe was the central front of the Cold War. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had amassed enormous conventional forces and thousands of tactical nuclear weapons on the continent. A war turning hot would have seen Europe become the primary battlefield, a scene of unimaginable destruction even before any intercontinental strategic exchange. The Fulda Gap in Germany, for example, was anticipated as a major invasion route for Soviet tanks, and NATO plans involved using tactical nuclear weapons, artillery shells, short-range missiles, even nuclear landmines, to halt such an advance. The use of hundreds, or even thousands, of these battlefield nukes, ranging from sub-kiloton yields to tens of kilotons, would have turned vast swaths of Central and Eastern Europe into radioactive wastelands. Unlike strategic air bursts over cities, many tactical nukes would have been ground bursts, designed to destroy armored formations or create barriers. Ground bursts are exceptionally dirty, throwing up vast quantities of irradiated soil and debris as fallout. This would contaminate agricultural land, forests, rivers, and grand rotted sources for decades or centuries, depending on the isotopes involved. Cities and towns across Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other fly-pent states would have been obliterated, not just by strategic bombing, but by intense conventional fighting coupled with tactical nuclear strikes. The density of industrial infrastructure, including chemical plants and nuclear power reactors, meant that conventional bombing and shelling alone would release vast amounts of toxic materials and additional radioactivity if these facilities were damaged. Imagine the Rhine, Danube, or Vistula rivers, vital waterways, becoming channels for chemical and radioactive poison. Historic cities, cultural treasures accumulated over millennia, would be reduced to rubble and contaminated dust. The continent would be fragmented, balkanized, not by politics, but by zones of lethal radiation and impassable destruction. Travel, trade, and any form of unified society would be impossible across these no-go zones. The charming villages, ancient forests, and productive farmlands that characterized much of Europe would become places of death and desolation, uninhabitable for human life for many generations. The dream of a united Europe would be replaced by a patchwork of isolated, struggling survivor communities, surrounded by poisoned lands, a grim testament to the ultimate failure of diplomacy and deterrence on the continent that had already endured 2 world wars. Number 1. The Doomsday Machine. That was actually real. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Cold War nuclear strategy was the development of systems designed to ensure retaliation even if a nation's leadership and conventional command and control structures were wiped out in a surprise first strike. The Soviet Union developed such a system known as perimeter, or colloquially in the West as dead hand. Details remained secret for a long time, but its existence and general function were confirmed by former Soviet officials after the Cold War. Perimeter was designed as a failed deadly deterrent if it detected signs of a nuclear attack on Soviet soil through a network of seismic, light, radiation, and overpressure sensors, and crucially, if it could not establish communication with the top military command, implying they were autonomously, or with minimal human involvement from a lower pre-authorized level, initiate the launch of the remaining Soviet nuclear arsenal. The system reportedly involved special command rockets that would fly over the Soviet Union, broadcasting launch orders to any surviving ISICBOMs in silos, mobile launchers, and potentially even submarines. The logic was brutal. To convince the adversary that a decapitating first strike was pointless because retaliation was guaranteed, no matter what. This removed the incentive for a surprise attack aimed at destroying the enemy's leadership and command systems. While designed for deterrence, the existence of such a system posed an incredible risk. What if the sensors malfunctioned? What if there was a catastrophic technical error, a misinterpretation of data? Say a series of large earthquakes combined with a communications breakdown. The potential for an accidental triggering of an automated full-scale nuclear response, even without direct human intent at the highest levels at that final moment, was a terrifying possibility built into the Cold War's architecture of mutually assured. It represented the ultimate nightmare. A world where human agency could be removed from the final decision to end civilization, handing that power over to a pre-programmed, emotionless machine designed for one purpose: apocalyptic revenge. While perimeter was a Soviet system, the US also had robust procedures for retaliatory launches under dire circumstances, though perhaps not as explicitly automated in its final triggering. The very concept of such doomsday machines highlights the terrifying logic that the superpowers were driven to by the nuclear arms race.